Who's watching the recorded version. I'm Karen Kedrowski, and I'm the director of the Carrie Chapman Catt Center for Women in Politics at Iowa State University. I've been in this position since January of 2019. I know many of you are probably familiar with my predecessor, Diane Bystrom, who's wonderful and continues to be affiliated with the center sort of informally. And I'm really glad that in the era of the pandemic, we have discovered Zoom and figured out how to be able to do these things so that we can continue to celebrate the centennial of women's suffrage. It's also National Voter Registration Day. So it's an especially fortuitous day to be talking about voting rights history. And I'm glad to be part of that conversation. So. All right, can you see this? Okay, so my topic here is a brief history of women's suffrage, which I will try to keep to a reasonable length of time. As a disclaimer, college professors are genetically programmed to speak in 15-minute intervals, so I will try and keep it under control. And I will stop periodically to ask if there are any questions. So a little bit of trying to advance here. A little bit of background. So the term suffrage and franchise both mean the right to vote. They're both kind of seldom used terms today, but they were the terms that were used during the suffrage movement. We also refer to advocates for women's suffrage as suffragists, not suffragettes. Suffragette was actually an insulting term. It was meant to kind of diminish the women who were working on behalf of suffrage. So people like Carrie Chapman Catt and Amelia Bloomer and so forth in the United States adopted the word suffragist. In England, women's rights advocates actually sort of adopted the term suffragette and made it their own, but not in the US. So why was this kind of a big deal? First of all, in 1787, when the Constitution was written, so that's the part of the Constitution that does not include any of the amendments, the Constitution of 1787 did not define voters at all. In fact, it delegated the time, place, and manner of elections to the states. And that included defining who was able to vote. The only stipulation that the Constitution said was that the voters for the US House of Representatives had to be the same voters as who could elect the more numerous branch of the state legislature, and that's it. What this meant effectively was that it was white male property owners, sometimes referred to as taxpayers, but a lot of taxes were property taxes, so that's where you get the property owners piece, over the age of 21. By one estimate published by the US Department of Justice, this was only 6% of the population that were actually eligible voters. So the 19th Amendment, I think it's worthwhile taking a look at the exact language. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on the basis of sex, and Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. Couple of interesting things about the Suffrage Amendment. First of all, it is patterned very closely to the 15th Amendment. It just replaces race, color, or previous condition of servitude with the word sex. Secondly, there are no pronouns in the entire amendment. And part of that has to do with the fact that the 19th Amendment, well, under the 14th Amendment, they talked about males being citizens in the 14th Amendment. And at the time, the masculine pronouns were were interpreted as being inclusive of men and women. So suffragists actually took the the states to court, saying that as citizens, they should be extended the right to vote because they were born in the United States, and that they would be included under the masculine pronouns, as was the interpretation at the time. And the Supreme Court ruled that, yes, masculine pronouns do include women, except when they don't. And that you could tell by context, context clues, when women were excluded, and on that basis ruled that women were not eligible to vote. Okay, so in terms of the women's suffrage movement, the roots of the women's suffrage movement really began in 1840, when Susan B. Anthony, who is pictured here on the right, and Lucretia Mott, who is not pictured, went to an international abolitionist conference with their husbands in London. Stanton went as an observer, but Mott was an elected delegate. And when they arrived at this convention, the entire convention was sent into turmoil because women had never attended these things, and these cheeky Americans not only sent women, but one of them was supposed to be a voting delegate and participating fully. And so the convention debated at some length about what to do and decided that the women could stay, but they had to sit in the back behind a screen and they could not speak or participate. Speaking in public was frowned upon by, women speaking in public was frowned upon socially, and these women were literally segregated and ostracized. And so Mott and Stanton started a conversation, and they began to realize that enslaved persons were not the only ones who needed some liberation. And they vowed at that moment that they were going to call a women's rights meeting or convention in the United States at their first opportunity. And they did so 8 years later in Seneca Falls, New York. And at this 3-day convention, the people who attended debated the Declaration of Sentiments. The Declaration of Sentiments was written by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and it's modeled after the Declaration of Independence, with a few notable exceptions, like we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal. And then at the point in the Declaration of Independence where Jefferson starts to list all of the complaints that the American colonists have against King George III, the delegates at the Women's Rights Convention not only talk about their complaints, but call for social reforms. And most of the reforms that they talk about, like women having the right to keep their own wages, to keep their inheritance in their name or any property that they inherit in their name, that there would be liberalized divorce laws, that in cases of divorce that women would be able to have custody of their children. All of those things were passed without a great deal of contention. The one provision that proved to be truly contentious and led to a deeply divided convention was to call for the right to vote. And in the end, only about half of the attendees at the convention actually signed the Declaration of Sentiments in 1848 because of the inclusion of the demand for women's suffrage. So as you can see, the suffrage movement had these close abolition ties. What we saw in the first generation of suffragists is that people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, who's pictured here on the left, that they came out of the abolitionist movement. Some of them were also active in the temperance or the prohibition movement, anti-alcohol, and they really saw the two as fitting hand in glove. So there's just any long list of people that we think of as abolitionists, like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth, who also were ardent suffragists. So the two movements really worked together, fighting for equal rights very broadly, for the end of slavery, for the legal reforms that enslaved people, once that they were freed, would enjoy full citizenship, and for women. However, after the Civil War, what happened is that the suffrage movement split over the 15th Amendment. So to review American history very briefly, after the Civil War, there were 3 Reconstruction Amendments that were passed. The 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment, which inserted the due process and equal protection clauses, but also put in place the word male for the first time. Birthright citizenship is another provision of the 14th Amendment. And then the 15th Amendment, which removed race, color, and the previous condition of servitude as a reason to deny suffrage. Because the 14th Amendment includes the word male, the 15th Amendment was interpreted correctly as only applying to formerly enslaved men. It did not apply to any women and did not apply to formerly enslaved women. Stanton and Anthony, who really are the leading lights of the suffrage movement, were absolutely infuriated by this. They wanted to have women included in the 15th Amendment, and they were told that it was the black man's turn, or the Negro's turn was the phrase that they actually used, meaning Negro male. There were 2 justifications for this. One of them, by Frederick Douglass, was that African-American men had suffered so gravely under slavery, with threats of violence and intimidation and lack of liberty and even murder, that they needed the vote, that they deserved the vote so that they could defend themselves within the political system. And that women, meaning especially white women, had not suffered in the same way. So therefore, the needs of formerly enslaved men came first. The second justification was that the United States could only handle one major reform at a time. And that it was the Negro's turn, and that needed to go forward, and that then they would begin to move forward together. The division, this issue of the 15th Amendment was so contentious that it actually split the suffrage movement. And it split the suffrage movement into one wing that was led by Stanton and Anthony that advocated an additional constitutional amendment that would enfranchise women. The other one, which was led by Lucy Stone and Lucretia Mott, advocated that women's suffrage be extended on a state-by-state basis. So the 15th Amendment is the first time that there is any amendment where at the federal level we are defining suffrage. It's actually seen as being pretty rare and unusual, and that this is the question of who votes is really rightly decided by the states. So you have these 2 groups, and the suffrage movement is split. And it is split for 20 years. And then we get to the year 1890. And in the year 1890, a number of interesting things happened. Sort of a big year. So the first thing is that the 2 branches of the women's suffrage movement come together and they are reunited. So the National American Women's Suffrage Association is formed out of these 2. There's still tension within this organization about whether to pursue suffrage at the state level or the federal level, but at least they're working together. The second thing that happened is that Wyoming becomes a state. And Wyoming's petition for statehood specified that women would have full suffrage, full voting rights for all races on the ballot. This had been the case in Wyoming as the territory, and it was sort of tolerated outside of Wyoming. They didn't have very many people and all that. But now that Wyoming wanted to be a state, this was actually quite a divisive issue. And some folks from Congress actually sent a message back to Wyoming saying, "Are you sure about this woman thing?" And the response was, "We would rather remain a territory than to become a state without enfranchising our women." So Wyoming was admitted as a state with women having full voting rights. So that becomes the first state that extends franchise to women. The third thing that happened in 1890 is that a young woman from Iowa by the name of Carrie Chapman Catt goes to her first NAWSA convention. So NAWSA is holding a national meeting every year held in different cities around the country. And she goes to one. She's been active in the Iowa suffrage movement, but has not moved on to the national stage. She goes to this movement and she catches the eye of Susan B. Anthony. And after, Catt had made some statement or something, Anthony sends her a note saying, who are you? Where are you from? What do you do? Essentially a note saying, tell me your story. And Catt responds, farm girl from Iowa, worked in newspapers, nothing notable about me at all, which I think is just an absolutely wonderful anecdote about her humility. Susan B. Anthony at this point is in her 70s. And she realizes that she and Stanton and the other first generation suffragists are not going to live to see the fruits of their labor. And that the suffrage movement must continue after them. So Susan B. Anthony begins to identify and mentor young women that she sees as the future of the movement. They are going to be their future leaders. These women are collectively referred to as Susan B. Anthony's nieces, even though they have no genetic tie, and they often refer to her and herself as Auntie Susan. Susan B. Anthony, so Carrie Chapman Catt is among these nieces of Susan B. Anthony that her proteges that she mentors. And Carrie Chapman Catt becomes Susan B. Anthony's hand-picked successor to be the president of NAWSA. And Carrie Chapman Catt served 2 terms as NAWSA president, from 1900 to 1904, and then 1915 to 1920. She stepped down in 1904 to care for her husband, George Catt, who was ailing, and he passed away in 1905. Shortly after that, she also suffered the losses of her mother and Susan B. Anthony and one of her brothers. So it was in a 2-year period that she suffered these significant personal losses. And then she traveled the world and became involved in the international suffrage movement. In 1915, she was persuaded to return as president of NAWSA because suffrage had been enacted at the state level very, very slowly, and sometimes only partially. It was very much in fits and starts, and there had not been significant traction on moving towards a federal amendment. And so the NAWSA organization realized that they needed Carrie Chapman Catt's force of personality, her leadership skills, and her organizational ability. So she agreed to return to the presidency of NAWSA as long as she could sort of do it her way. And in 1916, she put forward her winning plan. And the winning plan was essentially, we're going to do 2 things at once. We are going to continue to pursue suffrage at the state level in those states where we think it can get it passed. Because whenever another state enacts suffrage, then that state's congressional delegation is at least morally obligated to support a constitutional amendment. So, if we think that women have the right to vote in California, why not in the whole country, right? So that's the logic, that you will continue to move towards state level suffrage, but with the ultimate goal of getting a federal amendment passed. By the time that 1916 and 1917 roll along, however, the suffrage movement has actually split again. And you have Catt leading NAWSA, which is really kind of a mainstream traditional lobbying group, uses a lot of traditional techniques. And then you have a more militant wing, the National Women's Party, which was founded by Alice Paul in 1917. Now, Alice Paul and Carrie Chapman Catt were not fond of each other. Nonetheless, I find Alice Paul to be an absolutely fascinating historical character. First of all, she's the first woman to have earned a PhD in political science, so I like her for that reason, if nothing else. The second thing is that after she had finished her studies, she graduated from Penn State, she went to England. And she was pursuing her studies there at Oxford, and she came across Emmeline Pankhurst. And Emmeline Pankhurst was a leading British suffragette, and she also was one who really embraced some very militant and in-your-face tactics. Now, the British suffrage movement was far more violent than the one that we saw in the United States. I mean, they had riots, they would break windows, they would burn things. There was a woman who committed suicide by throwing herself in front of the King's racehorse. I mean, there is just a lot of that stuff that was going on that was really distasteful to Americans because of its violence. But Paul brought back to the United States a number of tactics that were adopted by the Pankhursts. So the first one was that you hold the party in power accountable for not supporting suffrage. So in that case, it meant the Democrats, even Democrats who supported suffrage, Paul and the National Woman's Party would campaign against them because they had failed to enact the National Amendment. The second thing was that they used peaceful demonstration. And they started to picket outside the White House. They called this group the Silent Sentinels. They came outside dressed in their fine attire in every kind of weather. They actually started in like January, and it was bitterly cold. So they would come out in the snow, 6 days a week, and they would stand outside silently, holding banners that called upon President Wilson to support suffrage. And this was the first time in American history that there was any sort of demonstration outside the White House, which I find astonishing, because if you go to DC now, there are protests outside the White House every day, sometimes more than one. You know, it's very much a part of our political tradition today. But it was not in 1917. It was a very new thing. They also burned Wilson in effigy. They read his soaring rhetoric about making the world safe for democracy in World War I, and then would burn his speeches. And this was very provocative, and it led to arrests. Over 250 suffragists were arrested, and many of them were held for as long as 7 months in the Occoquan workhouse. They were fed food that was inedible. It was laced with sawdust and maggots, and they were denied the ability to call their families, to contact an attorney, to get in, you know, read a newspaper, have any sort of contact with the outside world. They demanded to be treated as political prisoners, and they were not. They were, you know, forced to wear prison garb. They were forced to do labor. And to protest their conditions, which were actually worse than the criminal detainees that were in the same prison because they had committed crimes, Alice Paul and a number of other suffragists began to hunger strike. And this is the third strategy that Paul brought from England. And they began to hunger strike. And they became extraordinarily weak. Over 30 women actually engaged in the hunger strike. Paul herself was confined to solitary confinement. She was also forced to undergo psychiatric evaluation because they wanted her declared insane. The psychiatrist refused to do so, said she's not insane, she's just incredibly determined. And as she weakened, she was force-fed twice a day with a tube that was either forced down her throat or her nose, and she was and into that they poured a mixture of raw eggs and milk as a way of sustaining her. They also force-fed the other hunger strikers because some of them were becoming so weakened that the prison officials were worried that they would have a dead suffragist on their hands, and that would be worse. So they did force feed them. The treatment of these women was well known at the time. It leaked out to the press. There was such a horrific outrage that the women had to be released. And in the end, all of the charges against them were dropped. The charges, by the way, against these women was for obstructing traffic. So on the charge of obstructing traffic, they were held in solitary confinement and fed inedible food and force-fed in an absolutely torturous way. Are there any questions? No, good, all right. So sometimes people ask me, like, why was this such a big deal, right? We're very accustomed now after 100 years to the idea of women voting. So the question then becomes, like, why was this even contentious? So the suffrage movement was successful in part because it really became a mass movement in a broad coalition of people who espoused any number of causes. We already talked about abolitionists being early on partners. Towards the end of the movement, after, in the later decades of the movement, the temperance movement really joined in with suffragists and arguing that this would be a way for women to actually achieve their goals of temperance or prohibition if they have the right to vote. The women's labor union movement, which was formed especially around women who were in textile industries, wanted workplace reforms, workplace safety, minimum wages, maximum hours, things like that. And so they allied too with the suffragists. There were progressives and social reformers that were both men and women who espoused suffrage as what they saw as the next major reform that was needed in the United States. I think it's important to remember that there had to be a lot of men who supported women's suffrage, because men were all of the office holders, with the exception of Jeanette Rankin in the House of Representatives. So the women had to persuade men to give up some of their political power, and they could not have succeeded if there had not been men who were who were sympathetic to the suffrage cause. At the same time, there was a very well organized and very, very well financed opposition. So one was the liquor industry, which was very united against women's suffrage, not because they thought women shouldn't have the right to vote, but because they thought that if women did vote, it would put them out of business. And that's exactly what happened in some states as they expanded suffrage, that there was then regulation or elimination of the liquor industry. Industrial leaders, same thing, right? They were opposed to suffrage because they were opposed to the demands of the labor unions. The Catholic Church and other traditionalists who believed that having women having women voting would mean that they would enter into the public sphere and it would undermine women's role in the family and the family structure that they thought provided social stability, with the man being out in the world and the woman taking care of the home. And then Southerners were almost united in their opposition of women's suffrage, because they were concerned that if African-American women gained the right to vote, that it would upset the fragile balance of white supremacy in the South. So they really did not want to see any African-Americans enfranchised, and they were worried that if the 19th Amendment passed, that there would be millions of African-American women voting, and that they would vote their interests, which would be contrary to the power structure in place. Having said, both the pro and the antis were mass movements, and they involved people from all walks of life. And I think it's worth noting that there were actually a number of women who opposed suffrage as well and were leaders of the anti-suffrage movement. So the ratification struggle. The Constitution requires that a constitutional amendment be passed by 2/3 majorities in both the House and the Senate, and by 3/4 of the states, which was 36 states of a total of 48 in 1920. So mathematically, it was impossible to pass the suffrage amendment without some support from the South. Just even if it was very, very modest and tempered, the math just didn't work really without that. So the U.S. House of Representatives passed the suffrage amendment in 1918 and did so by a margin of 1 vote. The United States Senate passed the Suffrage Amendment in 1919 by a margin of 2 votes. And the battle came down to the 36th state, which was Tennessee. By the time Tennessee was considering the constitutional amendment, 35 states obviously had ratified. A number of states had voted against it, and there were only 5 states, of which Tennessee was one, that had not voted. 4 of those states were steadfastly opposed and either were not going to call the legislature into session to consider the amendment or would vote against it. So those 4 states were Vermont, Connecticut, North Carolina, and Florida. So that left Tennessee as the only last remaining possible state. And the Tennessee Senate passed the amendment early and very comfortably. And so it really boiled down to a 6-week battle for the Tennessee House of Representatives. And setting up shop for lobbying in the Hermitage Hotel was Carrie Chapman Catt and her NASA allies, with a special emphasis on women from Tennessee to lobby their own legislators. They took over the 2nd floor of the Hermitage Hotel, which is this grand old building that's across the street from the state Capitol building. On the 3rd floor were the anti-suffragists. So both movements were in the same hotel. The anti-suffragists adopted red roses as their color, so they festooned all of their rooms with red roses and Confederate flags. By contrast, the suffragists adopted yellow and the yellow rose, so they had sunflowers and roses and all sorts of, everything bedecked in yellow. On the 4th floor was a speakeasy. Prohibition had already been enacted, but the liquor industry in Tennessee set up a 24/7 bar that was open to all the state legislators. They could go up there anytime, get as much to drink as they wanted, and just listen to what the liquor industry had to say about suffrage. And this was done, well, 1, to persuade them, and number 2, to keep them so drunk that they might end up passing out and missing the vote. So there were, multiple layers to that strategy. The day that the vote came, which was August 18th of 1920, both the suffragists and the anti-suffragists thought that the measure was going to fail. They had all done their nose counting. They had talked to everybody. And they really thought that it was going to go down into defeat. What they did not know is that the youngest member of the state legislature, Harry Byrne, who was opposed to suffrage and wore his yellow rose boutonniere, had received a letter from his mother. His mother was an ardent suffragist, and she said, "Harry, be a good boy and help Mrs. Catt put the rat in ratification." And so, to everyone's surprise, he changed his vote, which then meant the majority went in favor of suffrage, much to everyone's shock. And the rest, they say, is history. Are there any questions? It's an amazing story. It's an absolutely amazing story. Okay, so meanwhile, what's happening in Iowa? Iowa's really sort of mirroring everything that's going on around the nation. So again, the suffrage movement started in 1848. By 1854, we see that there's the first public lecture that both focuses on temperance and women's rights. By 1855, Amelia Jenks Bloomer gives the first public address, so focusing solely on suffrage. Now, Amelia Jenks Bloomer is a notable woman in her own right. And there's Iowa should be very proud of Amelia Jenks Bloomer. First of all, before she moved to Council Bluffs, Iowa, she lived in Seneca Falls, New York. And she actually introduced Elizabeth Cady Stanton to Susan B. Anthony. And if you go to Seneca Falls, New York, there is a statue of the three of them where this meeting is depicted. So Susan B. Anthony, who became extraordinarily prominent and very famous, did not actually attend the Seneca Falls Convention. She was a later convert to the course of suffrage. Bloomer was an ardent suffragist, but she was also a dress reformer. So if any of you are wearing pants like I am today, you can thank Amelia Jenks Bloomer, who developed a new costume, a new outfit that was a long dress with no corset. The dress was really what we would call T-length, and underneath, women wore these very blousy pantaloons that she called them Turkish pants, but they tied around the ankle instead of having elastic. There were little ties. So, imagine, a fluffy dress with then these pants sticking out from the bottom. Quite scandalous for the time, but they became known as bloomers, named for her, of course. After that fateful day, a couple of years after that fateful day in Seneca Falls, where she changed history, Amelia Jenks Bloomer moved to Council Bluffs, where she lived out her life and was very well known across the state and the region as an advocate for both dress reform and temperance and suffrage. So what we saw in Iowa is that the suffrage question was also very contentious here, just as it was elsewhere. So women in Iowa did not gain full suffrage until 1920 with the ratification of the 19th Amendment. They did achieve partial suffrage on, achieve some partial suffrage on bond issues in particular. But I think you know how complicated it is to amend the Iowa State Constitution. It requires 2 consecutive state legislatures to pass it, and then it has to go up for a vote of the people. And in 1916, the constitutional amendment got to that point, but it actually failed rather decisively. But there was significant evidence also of voter fraud. So, women did not gain the right to vote, and it was extremely frustrating. But in 1919, Iowa did become the 10th state to ratify the 19th Amendment. I've talked a lot about the different kinds of organizations that were involved in suffrage, and that's mirrored here in Iowa as well. So we see that there are suffrage associations, we see the Women's Christian Temperance Union, we see an organization of women opposed to suffrage. We also see that African American women, club women especially, who are the educated middle-class African Americans, come together and begin to work on behalf of suffrage as well. There's a men's league for women's suffrage, and then the Iowa Federation of Women's Clubs. All of these groups are working on the suffrage issue, and they really are part of a national network. Importantly to know, African American women in Iowa were fully enfranchised by the 19th Amendment as well. Suffrage parades were a pretty big deal, pretty significant kinds of events that happened all around the country. Some of the most famous ones were in New York City in 1915 and then Washington, D.C. in 1913. Well, there were parades here as well. The first one, interestingly enough, is an anti-suffrage parade that was in Davenport, Iowa. One of the earliest suffrage parades in the country was actually in Boone, where the then president of NASA, Anna Howard Shaw, attended and spoke. It was held in conjunction with the Iowa Equal Suffrage League. We begin to see that there are automobile tours and a march for suffrage in Buxton. And interestingly enough, Mary Jane Coggeshall, who was really a leader of the Iowa suffrage movement, sued when she was denied the right to vote as a taxpayer in a bond referendum, and she won. So the city of Des Moines had to repeat the entire election. And of course, notably, Carrie Chapman Catt, who's from Charles City, Iowa, and a graduate of Iowa State, was the leader of the NASA, at the time that the suffrage movement was passed. To the degree that there was ever an international suffrage movement, she was the inspiration for that and one of the major organizing forces. And then after she retired from suffrage, she founded the League of Women Voters and then worked on peace issues until her death. Any questions so far? Okay, so what happened then? This is a question I often get. What happened then? Well, the League of Women Voters went to work trying to educate voters, but especially women, about issues of the day and how the political process worked. And what suffragists expected is that women would turn out in large numbers and that they would actually vote for a number of social reforms that were advocated by suffragists. And you can guess what those were. What did happen? First of all, women did not turn out at very high rates. Seems to be about 30% voter turnout. And that gap is fairly persistent over time. And then the women did not vote any differently than the men in their lives, again, which was not what suffragists expected. Moreover, we do know that the 19th Amendment did not fully enfranchise everybody or even everybody immediately. So no women of any racial or ethnic background were able to vote in 1920 in Mississippi and Georgia. In Mississippi, the voter registration deadline had already passed by August when the amendment was added to the Constitution, and the major election official refused to reopen registration for women. So they were not able to vote in 1920. In Georgia, the state legislature had to pass some enabling legislation, and they refused to do so until 1921. At the same time, African-American women were able to register and vote in South Carolina and in Florida. And Mary McLeod Bethune, who's a very notable African-American advocate, actually risked her life in Florida to register African-American women in the 1920s. Nonetheless, the South very rapidly expanded their Jim Crow laws to effectively disenfranchise African-American women, just as they had disenfranchised African-American men. And other women of color were disenfranchised for other reasons. So for example, in 1920, Native American women who had renounced their tribal membership were enfranchised. But it wasn't until 1924 with the Tribal Citizenship Act that lifted that expectation. And that Native Americans no longer had to renounce their tribal citizenship in order to become American citizens. So those women who did not wish to deny their Native heritage were then fully enfranchised. For example, Puerto Rican women were not fully enfranchised until the 1940s. Chinese women and men were denied the ability to be citizens, even if they were born in the United States, again, until the 1940s. So there were some women who were excluded because of race-based laws that applied to them. Fast forward 100 years, and women are now a majority of the voters. They have been since 1968, but they also, since 1980, have now vote at higher rates. So women are a majority of voters in part because they are a majority of the voting age population, but also because they're more likely to cast a vote. Also in 1980, we see the beginning of the gender gap. This is the first time that women vote differently than the men in their lives, with women being more likely to cast votes for Democratic candidates and men being more likely to vote for Republican candidates. The gender gap has been pervasive in any partisan election. At the presidential level, it has varied from 4% in 1992 to 11%, which was in 1996 and in 2016. Women have now achieved parity in terms of the numbers of women who give campaign donations. They still give less money than men, but as many women now are donors to political campaigns. And then there have been a number of reforms, court cases and laws that have removed legal discrimination on the basis of sex. At the same time, however, women are underrepresented in public life, and they are less likely to be active in politics in any way that we would measure that. So beyond voting and beyond donating to campaigns and any other sort of way of measuring civic engagement, women are less likely to be involved, even if they are in fact involved in their community in non-political ways, like church attendance and things like that. So here, looking at this, what we see is that women are 52% of the population, but that they are underrepresented when we look at the corridors of power, be they corporate, not-for-profit, or governmental. When we look at non-for-profit CEOs and get to those that are multi-million-dollar non-profits, you know, like your American Red Cross, your United Way, and things like that, what we find is that it's about 6%, just as it is in terms of Fortune 500. We see that the Supreme Court has lost a woman this week, and so the percentage of women on the court has fallen from its historic high. The number of women governors at 9 of 50 is less than the historic high, which was 11. And President Trump's cabinet with 17% is also less than about the 23%, which was the historic high for Presidents George W. Bush, Obama, and Clinton. In Iowa, there is a board that, or there's a law that calls for gender balance on public boards and commissions, even at the local level. And what we see is that women now comprise 33% of the members of local boards and commissions, but that's still far less than the 50% that should be in place. And then the other major loose end is that women do not have constitutional protection of equality. The Equal Rights Amendment to the Constitution was first introduced nearly 100 years ago by Alice Paul. This is what she did after suffrage, was to devote her life to the passage of the ERA. It was passed by Congress on March 22nd of 1972. It was not ratified by the 10-year deadline. There's been some effort to, and it was 3 states short, there was some effort to reignite the ERA by getting the last 3 states to ratify, and then removing the time limit so that the Equal Rights Amendment could be added to the Constitution. So far, that hasn't happened. The states have ratified, but the ERA remains in something of a legal limbo, and I can talk more about that in the Q&A if you'd like. What the ERA would really do is that it would elevate sex discrimination to the same level as racial discrimination. So racial discrimination falls under a judicial standard called strict scrutiny. And what that really means is that if there is any appearance of discrimination, that it is the burden of the defendant to prove that they were not discriminating, even if they didn't intend to, right? It's a very high standard that even if there's a discriminatory outcome, that should be seen as discrimination, and the employer or the agency or what have you, the higher education institution, should be held responsible for that. Sex discrimination, by contrast, falls under the intermediate scrutiny standard, which means that it is easier for a defendant to defend against a charge of discrimination by simply arguing that any sort of discriminatory outcome was not intentional. And therefore, they do not need to remediate in any significant way. Okay, what questions do you have?
I have a question about, you mentioned earlier with Alice Paul, and she was part of the more militant group versus maybe NASA, which was maybe a little more moderate. What do you think in terms of like the different approaches, the tactics they took? You know, do you think one was better than the other, you know, which may have had more of an impact on getting the 19th Amendment passed?
Oh, that's a great question, because both Catt advocates and Paul advocates argue that it was their strategy was the one that worked, that tipped the scales. I actually think that they complemented each other. So what happens is that a mainstream movement without a militant movement is seen as the crazy people. They're the ones that are seen as militant, even if they don't use those tactics. They're seen as unreasonable, and they're very easily or more easily ignored. When you have a militant side, what it does is that it drives policymakers, it puts pressure on policymakers, and it drives them to then make deals and to work with the mainstream group, because they don't want to handle those really crazy people over there. So it makes the mainstream group look mainstream and reasonable. And this is a pretty effective social movement tactic. So Alice Paul would not have gotten into the White House or gotten the sympathy of Woodrow Wilson. He did meet with her, but he really thought she was nuts. And he was very angry and embarrassed by what they were doing with the pickets. So he turned to Carrie Chapman Catt because she wasn't those, she wasn't those suffragists. And then Catt was really able to move the needle and persuade Wilson that he needed to come out in favor of the Suffrage Amendment and work with Congress to get it passed. But Catt would not have had that kind of access without the pressure from Alice Paul. You see a similar thing between, say, Malcolm X and the Black Panthers and Martin Luther King, right? Because of the militant parts of the civil rights movement, it made the mainstream movement gain access and be much more effective.
I have another question. How much impact do you think World War I had? Like, because women then had to be working, in factories and so on with men away. Do you think it was a huge impact? Like, if it hadn't happened, maybe it would have delayed the 19th Amendment, or?
Your voice was distorting a little bit, so.
Right. I guess I'm wondering how much impact you think World War I had on this because of women having to work in the factories.
That's great. Yeah.
Do you think it may have helped to accelerate some of this too?
That's a wonderful question. As it turns out, in the United States, we have a tradition of expanding voting rights after a major national crisis. So if you think about it, the 15th Amendment was passed after the Civil War, the 19th Amendment after World War I. The Voting Rights Act and the 24th Amendment were enacted, as a result of the unrest of the civil rights movement. And the 26th Amendment, which enfranchised 18, 19, and 20-year-olds, was passed as a result of Vietnam. So if it hadn't happened, and when you look internationally, you see that there's a whole lot of countries that enact women's suffrage really right after World War I. So we're not alone in having, a crisis. And part of the argument was that this was a way of paying women back for the contributions they made to World War I. So even though Carrie Chapman Catt was an ardent peace activist, when World War I began, she said, "We are behind you. We are patriotic. We will do all the things, we'll raise money, we'll send bandages, we'll, knit scarves, whatever we need to do to support the war effort and support suffrage at the same time." Paul did not engage with World War I at all. Now, interestingly enough, Carrie Chapman Catt was actually, because of her position in supporting World War I, was kicked out of some peace movements that she was a part of, which I think was very hurtful to her. But she saw it as, if we turn our backs on the war, then we're going to be labeled as unpatriotic and we won't be successful. And she was right. That's exactly what would have happened. If suffrage hadn't passed after World War I, I'm not sure when it would have passed. Maybe after World War II, if you think that we needed another major crisis. And maybe it would have even have taken as long as the 60s with the Voting Rights Act.
I guess following that thought, what do you think it'll take to get the ERA passed? Hopefully not another war, but
Yes. Well, I mean, the ERA is approaching its 100th birthday, and we are somewhat closer to seeing it pass than what we were in 1982, but it's still not there. Now, there are a number of states, including Iowa, that have enacted state-level equal rights amendments, which does provide some, some protection at the state level, but it's patchwork. And that's the downside of using state approaches. Other questions?
This is kind of an oddball one, but you mentioned in Tennessee that the anti-suffrage men in the legislature, whatever, they were wearing red roses. Do you know how they came to choose that as a symbol? Because I know there's groups now that are using that as a symbol, and I'm wondering if there was some history to it, or it's just something that happened. Somebody owned a rose garden or something.
So why the roses?
Yeah, it wasn't just by chance, or
yeah, it's kind of interesting. I'm not quite sure how they found those colors. Now, Alice Paul and the National Women's Party used the purple, gold, and white sashes. So I think the yellow, which was really a national one, and they had symbolism for those. Gold was, I don't know, purity, and purple was loyalty. I mean, they had that, but I think they would have just adopted the gold because it was already in wide use. So that would have been where the yellow rose came from. But I think my favorite part of that story, though, is that there were some legislators who actually carried boutonnieres of both colors in their pockets in Tennessee. And when they would be approached by, a lobbyist, they would take out the appropriate color rose and stick it in their jackets. They wouldn't be needled by the lobbyist. It's like, no, I'm with you, it's okay. And then they would switch it out as the antis came along and, slip in the yellow or the red rose or whatever. I think the florists did very well in Tennessee in 1920. Other questions? We good? Okay.
I was just going to say thank you very much for your talk. It was very interesting. I had heard some of the things before, but I did learn a few things.
Thank you. Well, it was my pleasure to do this.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, this has been very enjoyable. Thank you.
I have one other comment. My grandmother turned 16. Her birthday was on the 26th of August, and so she turned 16 just after it was ratified. So that it's always kind of been, I think she was very interested in it, but I was too young to do anything about it. But I think it did color her feeling about voting for the rest of her life. She always made sure she voted.
Yeah. Well, it was an enormous effort. I mean, it took 72 years, which is sort of astonishing, and really covered 3 generations of activists. And so I admire those women who worked so hard, and I admire the women who were jailed and force-fed, and I admire the women who were marching, and I admire people like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Carrie Chapman Catt, who literally devoted their lives to the cause.
Well, thank you very much. That was wonderful.
Well, thank you. Thank you for recording so that it has a longer life.
Yes, absolutely. So if those of you in the audience missed anything or would like to hear a snippet again, this has been recorded and we will be posting this on the library's Facebook page and YouTube channel. So we will have that available. And thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for hanging in there with me. All right, have a good evening, and thank you for the
You as
invitation.
well.
All right, good night. Go vote.